folks, Roger here. I'm a bit under the weather, but I have some free time, and so I thought I'd take that to share with you some thoughts about a topic I find exceedingly important. When we look around us, many of us are concerned and a bit bewildered about why it is that our culture is changing so drastically, and the pace at which it is changing seems to be increasing rapidly. What we could do, I think, is look at the surface, at the waves, and stop there. But it would be very helpful, I think, to look under the waves at the undercurrent and see what's sort of driving some of this cultural change. I will allow myself in this video to be a bit more direct and blunt than I have been in past videos about my own views, my own thought, and I understand that these things perhaps won't be popular. Feel free to disagree, but these are some of my considered opinions after some long thought and years in reading. I have come to the conclusion in my own life that though the world is a complicated place, full of nuance, full of complexities, not only is civilization a complicated thing, but individuals are complicated things. But at the end of the day, I think there are really two major options for individuals and, in a sense, for our civilization. There is a choice, I think, between Nietzsche and Christ. Allow me to explain that. It is very easy today, and it's a very popular thing today, to think that fundamental religious ideas or fundamental beliefs, whether philosophical or theological, are really just sort of surface ideas that don't affect the heart. These are things that you can, at the heart of what you are as an individual or as a culture, as a civilization, it's easy to think that these fundamental ideas are really out here somewhere and not close to the heart, and that this will stay the same even if we change these, what we see as more secondary ideas. What I'd like to politely suggest is the only reason that's possible to think that is because we live in a relatively safe civilization. We live in a comfortable time in history in which we benefit from modern comforts with air conditioning and plenty of deluxe coffees and loads of entertainment, or too much entertainment. And these things can pad us from, I think, the hard truth of facing belief systems as they are and working through the implications of these things. This is something I think we're losing. And what I'd like to do is just offer some thoughts with you about these two fundamentally different ideas, Nietzsche's view and Christ's view, and what the implications of these things are for us as a civilization and us for as individuals. Now, I know some modern atheists would tend to disagree with what I'm saying here. Modern atheism tends to act as though, and I've read plenty of atheists, but it's a very popular thing now to assume that moral systems will go rather unchanged, and that we can use human reason simply to invent our own morality or new morality, but that really fundamentally will stay the same if we reject the things at the heart of those moral systems. Now, please hear what I'm saying. What I'm not saying is that atheists are fundamentally more immoral than religious people. I'm not saying that. I don't think that's true. There is some fundamental moral reality to what we are as human beings that is universal to the category of beings that we belong to as humans. We are moral creatures. Whatever race, creed, religion, nation we're from, there are certain things that are natural to what we are as human beings. And so we have much in common morally with other cultures, other belief systems, even non-believers. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it is prudent to stare these ideas in their face and consider the implications for them. And this is what Friedrich Nietzsche did. And this is why, in my view, Nietzsche is to be more admired than pop atheists today. I've had some affinity in the past for some of the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens and others. But the more I've read, the more I've matured, the more I've considered these things, I see now that I think they missed a little bit of some of the deeper implications of what they're saying. And these are things that Nietzsche realized. So Friedrich Nietzsche was a man who grew up, of course he's famous for his atheism. He is a man who grew up with a father who was a Lutheran minister, if I understand it correctly. And so he grew up with some familiarity with the Christian world picture, with the Bible, with Christian doctrine. But Nietzsche's father passed away when he was either 4 or 5, and he was raised primarily without a father. And at a young age, he came to question Christian beliefs. And what he says in his writings is that he questioned them fundamentally at first for historical reasons, for how they developed through time. He began to think that Christianity was an arbitrary system that developed historically, he thought, for poor reasons. And he rejected it. Even though some scholars I've read say that in his notes he has some affinity for Christian thinking up until as late as 1861, before his mature adulthood. And there were also writings that we found supposedly in which he was rather blasphemous, I think indicating some tension within himself. But what is it about Christianity that Nietzsche hated? Perhaps you're familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, these ideas are difficult, and I'll try to summarize for you. But what I will suggest is that some have suggested that I'm overcomplicating these issues. I would politely suggest I'm not overcomplicating them. I'm seeing them as they are, and I'm trying to discuss them and think through the implications. And I think it prudent for others to do the same. Friedrich Nietzsche, keep in mind the context in which this man grew up. Nietzsche grew up in a time in which modernism had really taken hold on Western civilization in the universities and in academia. And Christianity, though many people still accepted Christianity, and even to this day accept Christianity as a fundamental belief system that steers society, Christianity had been rejected by his day. By the time of the Enlightenment, in which men that I've come to respect, like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, by this time, belief in God in the classical Christian theist sense was largely tossed out. We had economic progress, we had some of the ideas in the Enlightenment had led to scientific progress from which we all benefit. But the idea of this Christian system that had really been at the heart of late antiquity through the Middle Ages into the Reformation had been cast aside. In response to this, Christians who thought perhaps now that after the writings of men like David Hume thought that miracles, as they called them, were unscientific and likely or almost certainly did not happen, then began to read this back into the Christian system. And they saw central claims of the Christian faith, of the resurrection, as being nonsensical. But here's the thing. If these central claims like the resurrection of Christ or God's intervention in the world, the miraculous, are nonsensical, illogical, or unscientific, what does that mean for Christianity? Theological liberalism and Enlightenment thinkers, like Jefferson, thought that what we could do is hold on to the Christian moral system and the applied ethics that result from that, while tossing away the fundamental beliefs. At first, this seems like a good idea, man. All we need to do is follow Christ's example as far as living a moral life. But this only makes sense on the surface. As soon as you look underneath the surface and think about it for some time, and stare the ideas in their soul, you see that this is not true. Christ certainly was a controversial figure, not because he lived a moral life, but because he claimed to be something. And this is what was rejected. It's not the uncontroversial aspects of Christianity that were controversial. It's the controversial aspects. And what Nietzsche saw when theological liberals, Western folks who wanted to hold on to some aspect, remnant of Christianity, what he saw when they wanted to hold on to it is that if you reject the heart of the thing, you've killed the whole thing. So, what did Friedrich Nietzsche say? Allow me to read you a passage. This is from a book. I have the Cambridge edition here. This is a book Nietzsche wrote called The Gay Science, and I think it would perhaps be better titled today The Joyful Wisdom or The Joyful Knowledge. But this is a time, keeping in mind also as Nietzsche grew older, from the scholars I've read, his critique of Christianity grew less historically critical and more of a polemic. From some of the scholars I've read, Nietzsche became disgusted with the fact that Christianity did not die out. He expected it to die out, but the inertia of the thing kept it living on. And because he saw Christianity as an evil thing, towards the end of his life, as he grew closer to madness, he sought more and more to destroy it. And so his attacks began to grow more harsh. But allow me to read you a passage from Nietzsche. This is, of course, not a literal history. Keep in mind what he's saying. Haven't you heard of that madman who in the bright morning lit a lantern and ran around the marketplace crying incessantly, "I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God." Since many of those who did not believe in God were standing around together just then, he caused great laughter. "Has he been lost?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone to sea? Immigrated?" Thus they shouted and laughed, one interrupting the other. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Where is God?" he cried. "I'll tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we enchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling, and backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? Hasn't it got colder? Isn't night more and more night coming again and again? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning? Do we still hear nothing of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we still smell nothing of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe away this blood from us? With what water could we clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what holy games will we have to invent for ourselves? Is this magnitude of this deed not too great for us? Do we not ourselves have to become gods merely to appear worthy of it? There was never a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will, on account of this deed, belong to a higher history than all history up to now. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They too were silent and looked at him disconcertedly. Finally, he threw his lantern on the ground so that it broke into pieces and went out. "I'd come too early," he then said. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder need time. The light of the stars needs time. Deeds need time, even after they are done, in order to be seen and heard. This deed is still more remote to them than the remotest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It is still recounted how on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there started singing his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Let out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing, but what then are these churches now, if not the tombs and sepulchres of God? This is a difficult passage, but what Nietzsche is saying is that essentially these people who did not believe in God were still trying to function as though God existed, as though they hadn't killed him. And of course Nietzsche was an atheist. I've heard someone recently on YouTube suggest that perhaps Nietzsche was not an atheist. That's rubbish. Nietzsche is the most consistent atheist I've ever read, and I've read quite a few. What Nietzsche is saying is not that God existed literally physically and we physically killed him. What Nietzsche is saying is that the folks in his day were living in the shadow of the death of God, culturally, and they did not realize the implications. They killed him. They cast him down. They rejected him. And they didn't realize the implications of this. This was such a terrible and magnificent event, and yet they could not see the implications of it. What Nietzsche says is that there is no up, there is no down, there's no sense of direction, and we must make ourselves gods to be worthy of the deed that we've done. But you don't see it yet. The madman says, I've come too soon. I'll come back later when perhaps men will see the implications of what we've done. And I think, politely, theological liberalism often falls into this. I think, politely, new atheism also often falls into this. They don't see the implications of this death of God. Now, I'm not making this up. And there are future thinkers, future to Nietzsche, who wrote in great detail about this. T.S. Eliot was a poet who wrote in great detail. He was a modernist poet who I think at some point in his life began to despise modernism and the implications of this death of God. But what did Nietzsche think? Nietzsche did not applaud the death of God, as many in pop culture seem to assume. He realized that it was a magnanimous event, but he didn't applaud it. But what he saw was that he saw something that many folks today tend to not see. And that is, historically speaking, whether Christianity is true or not, historically speaking, Christianity has been a guiding factor, a mold which has shaped Western civilization. This is not an exaggeration. The gospel itself, the teachings of Christ, the New Testament, have so shaped Judeo-Christian values, Christian philosophy, have so shaped our views of art, architecture, law, morality, and the ethical systems derived from those moral views, that to remove God from the picture was to remove the foundation from much of our civilization. Nietzsche knew this, where perhaps many modern atheists bluntly just refuse to admit it. But what Nietzsche also thought was that Christianity, yes, had shaped Western civilization, but he found this repugnant. He thought that Christianity was evil. Why is this? Well, for a couple of reasons. There is a sense in which Nietzsche seemed to think that God eclipsed man. Nietzsche thought that Western civilization, Europe, Germany, in his time was sick. It had ceased to produce great men, and he blamed largely Christianity for this. not just Christianity, but what he called herd morality or slave morality. He saw Christianity especially, socialism, and not Marxist-Stalinist socialism, but polite socialism, democracy, and Christianity as manifestations of the herd or slave morality. And he thought it was a terrible thing. He actually looked to, if you recall, the musical piece Flight of the Valkyries by Richard Wagner. He believed for a time in his life that Wagner, from drawing from these older pagan stories, was going to reinfuse perhaps Europe with power and strength from the age of heroes. One scholar I read suggested that Nietzsche thought the paradigm of civilization was 5th century BC Greece, and he wanted this to shape and infuse Western culture, Western civilization. But what is it about Christianity, this slave morality, which he saw underlying Christianity, that he so hated? Because in a sense, God, when he's in the picture, it eclipses us. It represses man from becoming what he should be, sort of a hero. There's a Superman comic, I believe it's Superman Unchained, in which the character Lex Luthor is very Nietzschean. In fact, in the last 20 years or so, Superman comics have been written in the way that the character Lex Luthor is not just a mastermind criminal. He is a very philosophical person, and he sees himself as the epitome of humanity. He loves humanity. And what he thinks is that, there's, I believe it's Superman Unchained, there's a frame in which he's reading Plato, and Lex Luthor is the physical peak of what men can accomplish. He's physically superior to most men. He exercises constantly. He's read Plato. He understands the great ideas from world thought. And he sees this foreigner, this godlike figure of Superman from a foreign world, as eclipsing what humanity can become and really oppressing us and stinting our growth. To me, that's very interesting. That is a very Nietzschean thing to think. It is not dissimilar to what Nietzsche seemed to think of God. But it was more than that, because Nietzsche had a concept that in English we would say resentment, and I don't think that's probably the best translation. What Nietzsche thought was that in the past, historically, slaves, lower classes of human beings, were enslaved, and that they didn't, when enslaved and when placed in change and when placed under rule, they did not fundamentally change who they were. They were still creatures with the will to power, with desire for power, with lusts, with pride, with cruelty. But what they did, because they could no longer express those things outwardly, they rather repressed them, they shoved them down. And that those repressed lusts and desires for power and cruelty and things that they would rather express, when shoved down into their psyche, became the conscience. The conscience that you and I perhaps assume is natural to what we are. Nietzsche thought it was an arbitrary thing that was built up over time from so many repressed desires. And the slave class, when they could not express these things, grew resentful, not just on an individual level, but as a class of people, as a lower class. They grew resentful for their masters. And this was ressentiment. And so what Nietzsche thought was that this slave morality manifested in Christianity. And so Christian morality is really an expression of this resentment. It's not just passive aggressiveness. This is something utterly wicked. And this is a passage from the Cambridge Companion to Nietzsche. And he says, and the scholar here says, when aggression, cruelty, lust for power, etc., could no longer be expressed directly on penalty of death, these drives turned inward. A quote from Nietzsche. Almost everything we call higher culture is based on the spiritualization and intensification of cruelty. This is my proposition. The wild beast has not been laid rest at all. It lives, it flourishes. It has merely become deified. The scholar again. The result of this transformation and internalization was conscience, which under these circumstances primarily made itself felt as bad conscience. Since this annoying inner tension called for relief, the suffering slaves projected someone or something they could make responsible for their misery, specifically some hostile demon. This identification of the responsible one called for a further step, the projection of someone else who was able and willing to fight and subdue the fiend, namely, the supreme God. So these slaves projected this inner tension and angst and cruelty and lust for power and desire to live freely. They projected this onto their masters as they were now the enemy, and God was someone who could deliver them. And so Christians through history have sometimes taken glory, sometimes I think some Christians perhaps are too happy with the idea of martyrdom because they see some glory in their persecution. Nietzsche thought this was for no good reason other than the fact that this was ressentiment. This is a wicked thing to him. This is weak men and women who desire to have power, pretending that they don't. It's a lie. Christian morality is based on a lie to Nietzsche. It's all false. But what Christian morality, some would think, has done is to free the slave. Historically, there is some truth there, but not for Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought instead that Christian morality rather allowed the slaves to enslave their masters. And so in the modern world, when these people think that they don't believe in God, really democracy and this polite socialism and these Christian ethics and Enlightenment deism, in Nietzsche's mind, what they've really done is they've taken the Christian ethics and the morals, and they still kept these things. They're trying to hold on to them still. And what they've done instead is overthrown the masters, the aristocrats, the monarchs, and they've made the strong subservient to the weak. And this, for Nietzsche, was utterly evil and wicked and repugnant. What Nietzsche thought was that the strong should rule the weak. Christianity, democracy, didn't allow this. These were lies based on lies that allowed wicked things in his mind to happen. It was, to Nietzsche, it was a point of honor that strong and honorable men should reject Christianity. It was the burden of honorable and strong men in Nietzsche's mind, I think increasingly as he aged, to do what he called the revaluation of all values, to revalue the things, our moral values. And what Nietzsche thought we should do is that the strong should be allowed, of course, to express themselves, to achieve their full potential, to be heroes in this ancient sense, and create their own morality. And there are many things we could be said here, but I think fundamentally, this is the thing that, this is the point at which modern New Atheism differs from Nietzsche. And I think modern New Atheism gets this incorrect. These are not slightly different ways of seeing the world in which, you're a Hindu, you're a Muslim, you're a Buddhist, you're an atheist. Yes, we can all get along. I believe this. Yes, we can coexist peacefully in society with our differences of beliefs, provided we have some unifying factor, provided we have some common reason to believe in something that we all hold dear. But fundamentally, these worldviews are different ways of viewing the very fabric of reality. The Dalai Lama said this. I've heard so many young people, when they leave Christianity, often they flirt with Buddhism and things of this nature. And Buddhism and Christianity have many parallels. They have many things in common, and I think some things in Buddhism are to be admired. But they are fundamentally, centrally different ways of viewing the very fabric of this universe. The Dalai Lama said in the book, I believe, Becoming Enlightened, that when he comes to the West, and young people come and say, yeah, I've since learned that Christianity and Buddhism are very much alike. He says he almost wants to laugh because he knows fundamentally these are non-compatible, fundamentally different worldviews. This is from the Dalai Lama. Atheism is no different. And Nietzsche saw this. Atheism and Christianity are fundamentally different ways of viewing the cosmos, the fabric of reality. Nietzsche saw this. Well, there are many things that could be said here, but what are some implications? Nietzsche thought that in the modern world, and this coming into the postmodern world, we could reevaluate, we could make our own systems of morality, we could revalue all values. He knew in between the rejection of Christian theism and Christian morality would come a period of nihilism. Nietzsche was not a nihilist. He wanted a new morality. But he knew a period of nihilism was coming. He predicted that there would perhaps be a great period of violence, and he was right about this. The West went through catastrophic moral convulsions. One has to look no further than World War I and the Second World War to see this. And we're going through the ripples of this great moral event of the death of God even today. And it hasn't played out, I think, like Nietzsche would have thought. Nietzsche, I think, would look at the current postmodernists in culture, and I think he'd despise them. Because I don't think it's played out how he would have wished. But it's happened, in a sense, because of what he's said, what he's done, his way of thinking. He did not cause the death of God. He merely acknowledged the death of God in culture. But he worked to drive the nails in the coffin. Just read his books. He rails against Christianity. He finds Christian theism absolutely repugnant and thinks any man of honor should reject it. What are some implications of Nietzsche's view and how they've affected us today? Well, the implications of Nietzsche's view, and I think there's a sense in which he's correct, is that if Christianity, coupled with classical ideas, are central to Western civilization, to the development of our ways of thinking about art, morality, law, if there is no Christianity, if Christianity is based on lies, then these developments, the entirety of Western civilization, is based on lies, on arbitrary, fake systems of morality, of thinking about beauty or law. And he thought this was the case because he hated the what Western civilization had become. But if Christian morality and philosophy and teachings are arbitrary and false, what does that mean about history? It means what the postmodernists tend to think, that Western civilization has simply oppressed nonconformers, those who wish to express themselves in nonconformist traditional ways are simply oppressed minorities. Now let me say this, please. It is very easy today to see everything through the lens of human rights. And I've thought this way in the past before. What we think when we see all of these different competing views and ways of life being elevated in culture today, what we tend to see is simply us expanding the umbrella of rights and liberties to those who don't agree with us. That's what postmodern deconstructionism is being sold as. It's being packaged and sold as liberty and freeing the oppressed. What I'm suggesting to you is that that is not the whole picture. The whole picture is these are fundamental, non-compatible ways of thinking about human nature in the world that are non-compatible with 2,400 years of thinking in Western civilization. We would be naive to think, if we reject the thinking that has shaped this civilization, that civilization will go unchanged, or that it will change for the better. Here's who followed Nietzsche. And this is a complicated nuance. Those of you who have read philosophy will perhaps think I'm not being precise enough. But from Nietzsche, who thought that Christian morality was arbitrary, God does not exist, Christian theism is false, and Christian morality is evil. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French existentialist thinker. When he realized this, what did he conclude? He concluded that God does not exist and that human beings are damned and condemned to be free to choose their own way in life. There is no purpose. There is no meaning. To Jean-Paul Sartre, human existence is absurd. It's a terrible thing. Whereas the natural law thinkers, going back to Aristotle, through the Western tradition of Aquinas, into John Locke, and into Thomas Jefferson, had thought that morality and these things are natural to what we are as a class of beings, as humans. No. Where some in the past have said that essence precedes existence, meaning that what it means to be a human pre-exists your individual existence as a human. And you were born into this class of beings, and here is a nature that is handed to you based on what you are. Sartre realized, no. If there is no God, if Christian morality is arbitrary, if it's false, no. Your existence now precedes your essence. You simply exist. There's no essence to what you are. You must choose your own morality, your own way of thinking, your own purpose, your own meaning, and it's a damnable thing. It's absurd. And Sartre saw the consequences of this. This is not polite, this is a hard truth. Sartre looked it in his face, and he took it a step further. Well, think about further thinkers. Michel Foucault. Not only does God not exist now, what did Foucault say? Foucault, a Frenchman in the new postmodern tradition, said that not only is God a lie, but humanity is a lie. Humanity has disappeared. Humanity itself has become a social construct. We have made up these ideas of humanity and hence morality. And we simply oppress people who don't conform to our arbitrary, concocted ways of thinking. Judith Butler is a contemporary thinker, gender theorist. And she says, well, she takes it a step to its logical consequences further. If there is no God, if there is no truth to Christian morality, if there is no concrete human nature, then of course gender is arbitrary. And gender roles are things that are constructed socially in Western civilization, and you are made to conform to it. You perform these preconceived gender roles that are handed to you based on your context. And so you perform it. But if these are all arbitrary, non-natural norms, then to buck against it is to simply express yourself the way you choose to be. And so I hope you see that this has spiraled, in my view, out of control. But these are logical implications going all the way back to the death of God. What are the alternatives? Well, I think to look with Nietzsche into the hard truth of the death of God, and to look into what we are, is to look into the abyss. And if you look long enough into the abyss looks back into you. And these are hard truths. These are hard things. These are things that have to be wrestled with and considered. What's the alternative? Well, I think this. I think that if there is no God, Nietzsche was correct. This man is, even though some of his rhetoric, his polemics are laughable to me, I think he is terrifyingly right about the nature of the cosmos and the nature of humanity. If, at heart, Christian theism and these classical Christian ideas are utterly false based on lies. That is the fundamental mistake, to be blunt, that Nietzsche made. I believe that there are strong reasons to think that Christian theism and much of the thinking that has come out of that foundation is actually true. When I compare Nietzsche to the thing he hated most, and I look at the thing he hated, I think at this point in my life, for some time he was appealing to me. For some time, now I would suggest that no one should read Nietzsche and just become an atheist like this. That's folly. But there were times when I would read Nietzsche in the past, and I would see Christian men who submitted themselves to overbearing pastoral figures, and I thought, man, perhaps he's right. Perhaps Christianity makes strong men weak. And that is to be despised. And I had seen this. I do think, if I'm being blunt, and I am in this video, I think that contemporary Christianity has a masculinity problem. Contemporary Christianity too often produces men with no sense of honor. We've lost this. With a lack of courage, with a lack of manliness. We've been absorbed into this modern and postmodern abyss. And Christianity, I don't think is the root cause of this, but there is a masculinity problem in Christianity. I fully acknowledge this. And so for a time I thought, man, perhaps Nietzsche is correct in this. But I think at the end of the day, he's not correct. Well, we'll get to this later. What are the alternatives? To consider Christianity, we would do well, I think, to look at Christ. What is the contrast between Friedrich Nietzsche and Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ? Well, I would suggest to you that you read the New Testament as an adult, and you read it carefully, and you consider the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the teachings of Christ, and the action of Christ, and the implications of that. If Christian theism is true, if God exists in the way that the Judeo-Christian tradition has held, and if Jesus of Nazareth is him coming to dwell with us, and if he died, and if he truly rose again, not in a fairy tale way, but literally, think through the implications of what this means on a civilizational level and an individual level for you and for me. It means lots of things we don't have time to cover here. But it means, first of all, that at the center of the universe, what does the scripture say? God is love. It means that pre-existing the cosmos, that God brought into existence out of his own power, if this is true, that God is eternally love. We are now the direct object of God's love. If this is true, then whoever you are, this sounds cliche, but God indeed loves you. This is in contrast to certain other religions in which God hates the sinner. No, This is true, God loves you, but before you were created, before this cosmos was created, God was love within himself. We don't have time to go into discussion of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, but it has been thought for a very long time in Christian theism that inside of this triunity, God is one God, but within himself he has love. And his creation of the cosmos is simply an overflow of that love. This is a fundamentally different way of thinking about the cosmos, the fabric of reality. If Nietzsche is correct, that's not the case. It means that if Christianity is true, if Christ, moreover, is true, it means that there is pre-existing this universe. There is the logos, the rationality. Now, Plato thought, as I'm sure you know, that things that exist in this world exist in a lesser form. They existed in a greater form in some sort of Platonic heaven. The abstract, or rather more concrete ideal existed out there, and we simply have inferior copies here. That's why, if I understand it correctly, Plato didn't like so much the arts, because they were trying to reproduce inferior copies of things that were already inferior copies of the true ideal. Plato wanted to get us in contact with the true ideals behind the universe. And the logos, the rationality, I have no reason to think, if Plato thought that the tree you see outside is an inferior copy of a more concrete, more true, more real tree in his Platonic heaven, then the logos, the rationality that we observe, I think also is grounded in this sort of abstract Platonic heaven. But Christianity said, that's not the full picture, Plato. The Gospel of John, the 1st chapter. In the beginning was the logos. This rationality pre-existed this cosmos. And out of God's rationality, he is the rationality. And out of his rationality, his very nature, he brought into existence a rationally coherent universe. And the logos was with God. And the logos was God. This sort of, not only is love grounded in the existence of the Christian, Judeo-Christian concept of God, but rationality is as well. Mathematical truths are not contingent truths, they're necessary truths. They're things mathematicians, many of them that are read, seem to think that we don't invent, we discover them. Well, Sir Roger Penrose is a contemporary physicist, but he's also a Platonist. He thinks these exist somewhere concretely, but in a Platonic realm. Many Christians have thought, no. These things have existed as necessary truths in the mind of God. All of these things are grounded in this being that we call God. These are not artificial, arbitrary things, but fundamental realities that are ingrained into the fabric of this cosmos. Goodness is no different. God is good, and he is the source of goodness, and therefore moral goodness is grounded in the existence of God. These are not arbitrary rules. These are fundamental truths, and to do immoral things, to rape, to murder, to steal, is to warp and to bend and to break the very fabric of the cosmos. This is a fundamentally different way of thinking about this. And I think this comes from the first few chapters of Genesis, which Jesus of Nazareth seemed to give credence to. But consider who Jesus is. For Nietzsche, it was an abominable thing for the weak to rule the strong. The strong, rather, should rule the weak. We'll consider the entire Christian message. The Christian message holds that the God of the universe, the architect of the galaxies, took upon himself a body of flesh. And without ceasing to be God, he took on the likeness of man. And why did he do this? So that he could help the weak. He could die for the sinful. He ministered to the poor. He gave an example of charity. No greater love have a man than this, that he should lay down his life for his friends. He taught self-sacrificial love. And in the Christian story, if it's true, the most powerful being in the universe gave the deepest thing he could give and sacrifice for the weak. How abominable to Nietzsche this must be. The question, I think, is whether or not it's true. If there is no God, if there is no truth to Christ, then Nietzsche is correct. But if Christianity is true and if Christ is true, then I think Christ is correct. What did Christ teach in comparison to Nietzsche? Well, I would suggest, if you're interested in learning what Nietzsche thought, read Nietzsche. He's a difficult thing. His books are difficult to read. They're ideas that must be wrestled with. But read Nietzsche. It has been said that you can't really understand Nietzsche without a guide, because he's so complex and convoluted and shifting, and there's tension between his ideas, and he seems to change as he gets older, and perhaps he wears a mask here. I understand this, but read Beyond Good and Evil for yourself. See him as he is. Wrestle with his ideas. If you want further help, one scholar I think is particularly good is Walter Kaufmann. Some Nietzsche fans would disagree with me there. Walter Kaufmann has a book called Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, and Antichrist. It's a good one. And also, the Cambridge Companion to Nietzsche is a very good guide, I think, to just kind of summarizing some of Nietzsche's thoughts. Read these things. But what I suggest to you is to read the Gospels as an adult. We have in this culture something. I am frankly done with this polite, businesslike, artificial Christianity. If Christ is true, take the time to read the Gospels. Look at his teachings in the face. They're hard teachings, and consider what they mean for you. Christ taught to love your enemies. Nietzsche named this in Beyond Good and Evil. He named this teaching specifically, and he thought that this teaching of loving your enemies was actually the deepest cruelty, because it's a lie. I believe it was Kaufmann. Yes. The reevaluation, Kaufmann says, of Nietzsche's thought, is thus the alleged discovery that our morality is, by its own standards, poisonously immoral. That Christian love is the mimicry of impotent hatred. That most unselfishness is but a particularly vicious form of selfishness. And that ressentiment is at the core of our morals. To love your neighbor, Nietzsche thought, was not true love, it was fear of your neighbor. You only love him because you fear the implications of doing what you will to do. If you truly do what you will yourself to do, these lusts, these cruelties, these power that you have inside of you, you only love him and get along with your neighbor because of the consequences and the fight and the violence that might be done to you of what if you enact what you feel on the inside. That might be true if Christ is false. But what did Christ teach? He said, you've heard that it has been said of them of old time, to love your neighbor, but hate your enemies. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Pray for them which persecute you and despitefully use you. This is God's will for you, to love not only your wife and your children, but your neighbor and his wife and his children. And not only your neighbor and his wife and his children, but your enemy and his family. You love them as well. That's a hard thing to do. We can candy coat this. We can pretend. We can take this with a grain of salt and dismiss it. But that is a hard thing to think about. To love your enemies? What if your enemy actually wounds you? What Christ did not advocate here, I think, is weakness. He didn't advocate, I think, some sort of extreme pacifism. There are times, I think, when it is the honorable and right thing to do to stand up and protect the weak against evil men. And yet even still, Christ said, love your enemies. This is not a popular thing to say in culture today. But Christ said, you have heard that it's been said of them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her in his heart has committed adultery already. What Christ is doing here, I'm not sure he's actually drawing the equivalence morally between all immoral acts, but what he's saying is that morality is a deeper thing than just your actions. When Nietzsche said that these are cruelties and lusts for power and arrogances and wills to power inside of your heart, Christ is actually saying, look what's in your heart. Take a hard, truthful look. Put away all the niceties and politenesses and look at what is in your heart. And the things that you don't want other people to see you do, are they in your heart? Is hatred in your heart? Is lust and immorality and adultery in your heart? That's a tough thing. I'm not going to pretend to you, as a man in this century, that this is an easy teaching, but it is what he taught. It's a hard saying. Morality goes deeper than the actions. Christ taught sacrificial love. He taught that it's possible to gain the whole world and yet lose your own soul. This is a difficult passage. This is a difficult saying in modern capitalist America. Capitalism has blessed the world. I saw a study in which, in the last 20 years, so much of the world has been brought out of poverty. That's a wonderful thing. And yet to gain and to get and to keep gaining is possible and still be eternally bankrupt in your soul. You can gain the whole world and lose your own soul. There is more wealth to be had that can be measured in dollars. These are hard sayings. Christ taught that we should recognize that if God is true, Christ taught that we should recognize that God is actually in control. And I am a husband and a father, and this saying for me, when he says to be careful for nothing, it doesn't mean don't plan, don't plan ahead and be responsible. What it means is at the end of the day, God has providence in this world. That can be a difficult saying as someone who wants to be a strong, independent person. Something to think about. Christ also taught, this is a difficult saying, that all of us, each of us, the best of us, to the last man, woman, and child, is in need of redemption, of salvation. Why? Because of what we've already said. Because even those of us who consider ourselves to be good people, we all of us in here, in our heart, have the capacity for extreme and terrible evil. Perhaps many of us never maximize that potential, but it is a part of what we are. And each of us need this, what Christians call salvation, this redemption. And Christ claimed that he came to offer that to us. That's a hard saying, because it makes us morally inferior to someone else, and that person is God. And when we think about that, that's not a pleasant thing. That is contrary to what Nietzsche thought. We should be morally strong and powerful and revalue our values and enact these values and will ourselves to power in a sense. Christ said, no. Your righteousnesses are as filthy rags. And even the best of you has moral flaw, has sin, and you're in need of redemption. That's a hard saying. Now, if you take all of these things together, if Nietzsche, in summary, there's so much more that should be said here. I'd like to tease these things out for you and make the connections for you more. But what I'll summarize is this. If Nietzsche is correct, then Christian morality is arbitrary, and it has been used to rather oppress people. It has, in Nietzsche's view, been used to allow the weak to control the strong, and we need to do away with it. And the more quickly we can do this, the better. But I think if he's right, if Christian morality is arbitrary, then Sartre is correct, and Foucault is largely correct. Humanity is nothing. Morality is nothing. Gender roles are nothing. But think about what we throw out with this Christian role picture. We throw out 2,000 years of development that has benefited us, of moral thinking, of thinking about law, of Western art, of architecture, of cultural identity, of theology, and the things that are tied to that. We value, in the West today, we value human rights. Read the Declaration of Independence. What are human rights philosophically tied to? They are tied to some fundamental Christian view of what it means to be human. I wish I were wrong about this, but after reading all that I've read, I'm not. If you throw out the foundation, you are crumbling the foundation for human rights. Hence today, the discussion of human rights is shifting. The upcoming generations see human rights very differently, not as fundamental natural rights, but as arbitrary things that can be shifted and manipulated and attenuated. If Nietzsche is correct, then I think Foucault and Butler are correct. Though Nietzsche wouldn't like it, I think they just took this thinking to the next level. But if Christianity is true, then the things underpinning Western civilization, though we have not always upheld it, though it's taken time for us to develop some of these ideas and extend them, the ideas of rights, for example, to others, Western civilization has never been a perfect thing. There is no point in the past which I can look back to and say, man, they had it all together then. No, but this 2,000 years of civilization being shaped by this fundamental idea, if you discard the idea, your civilization crumbles. What does it mean for you as an individual? Think about what you are. What I'm suggesting is this. If you go with Nietzsche, stare into the abyss. Set the niceties aside, set comfort aside, and stare with naked honesty and some sense of manliness the abyss in the soul, and think about what it means. But if Christ is true, look into the light. Looking into the light is perhaps a more difficult thing because it's uncomfortable. The book of 1 John talks about this. The light reveals what we are. There are things about each of us that we would not do publicly, but that are in here or in here that we would like to keep private, either in our thoughts or in our actions. And the light reveals those things. But a healthy look into the light is needed to see what we are. Look with Christ into the light. Look at Christ, who is the light, and consider what he thought, what he taught, who he was, and what he did, and the implications not just for our civilizational ways of thinking that underpin our civilization, and they do. Think about what it means for you. I hope you'll consider these things. I think at the end of the day, to my mind, there is a choice, and the choice is between Nietzsche and Christ. At this point in my life, I am utterly convinced that Christ is true and Nietzsche was mistaken. That's a thing I'm actually quite thankful for. I want to say, as always, I very much appreciate your time. I know these videos tend to be a bit lengthy, but I think these ideas are very much worth some serious thought. And I would ask you to take a mature, hard look at these things and consider the implications for your life. It seems to me that there's a clear choice between Nietzsche and Christ. I know there are many other worldviews out there, and I mean no disrespect to them, but I think at the end of the day, to my mind, there is a clear choice. And if Nietzsche, it's the abyss. And if Christ, there is hope. And this is true not only on an individual level, but also, I think, on a cultural level. And again, I very much appreciate your time. I hope you have a great day. God bless you.